And welcome back to another episode of B to Z Gap, episode number 3. And I'm back with my Uncle Bob Humphreys. I'm Zach Humphreys. Thank you so much for coming back and listening to us. We're going to make a little switch and go away from politics tonight and talk more about something that affects us all. And we're going to talk about mental health. And we have a psychologist with us here tonight too. So Uncle Bob, I just kind of want to start with defining mental health because, you know, we kind of live in a society now where we hear it all the time and its importance, and it's kind of become like a buzzword in a sense, right? And I want to hear from you. How do you define mental health in 2021?
You know, I always make comparisons to physical health, and mental health really isn't so much mental as it is emotional. And it also has a social component. Now, there are some aspects where we're dealing with thinking and cognition and those kinds of things. But when we think about mental health, we're going to talk about it in a much broader way. We talk about emotional health. We talk about social health. And we can talk to some degree about, you know, the mental in terms of the cognitive health. But when we look at it, all of those aspects and all of those dimensions can have an impact on physical health. So really, when we talk about it, it is a component to health that is often ignored. Again, I know we were supposed to stay away from politics today, but when we had the Affordable Care Act go through, they put a great emphasis on mental health that we hadn't seen in any kind of legislation with respect to insurance reimbursement that we had never seen before. And sometimes, and again, I'm not sure why mental health has been a target, but sometimes the insurance industry, probably because they've been able to get away with it, has oftentimes nickeled and dimed the mental health component, the same way that they've done with certain aspects of physical health, but they had a harder time getting away with that based on the way the legislation was constructed. So we have this greater emphasis that probably started with affordable care. And as we move forward, we're seeing that one of the places that seems to have an impact right now is the mental health component because of COVID-19. And so we'll talk about a person who spends 23 hours a day, most of the week, in an apartment in a large city that's probably smaller than this room that I'm sitting in. And they can get out to go pick up something to eat, or they get out to go to the grocery store, but they're working from home. They can't go to the gym, so they're doing all their recreating at home, and they're in these boxes. And if you put into those boxes other people, so in homes where you have both parents working from home, in addition, you have the kids doing school from home, there's like this whole degree of togetherness that as the novelty of that is worn on, has started to compromise at least some people in terms of mental health. And it's changed a lot of things. I think it's become, for some people, there was a bonding experience, and for other people, it really pushed them apart because there was almost too much togetherness, and their lives weren't really geared to doing it that way, you know.
So when you see somebody in your own experience struggling with mental health, what type of characteristics do you see?
Well, we used to say that the common cold of the industry was depression. And the later statistics, the statistics that are coming out now, and particularly for the millennials, so we're seeing more anxiety. And there have been some folks that have conjectured, oh, this is part of the helicopter parent generation, that we were too protective and they didn't learn to cope well, so they experienced more anxiety. I'm not really sure of all the efficacy of that, because there are some people that were raised in very traditional kinds of ways and the parents were not helicopter parents, and yet we still see the same levels of anxiety. And you begin to wonder, what is that about, and how does that happen, and how does that take place? So now when we talk about the common cold of the industry, with these later kinds of findings about the millennials and how they're being affected, we're probably going to say the two major areas of mental health would probably be depression and anxiety. Now, that's not to say that there aren't more serious illnesses out there that we probably should be paying attention to. There are some, we can talk about schizophrenia as a major mental health illness. We could talk about bipolar as being a major mental health illness. And so there are other things out there. But if we use those broader categories, depression and anxiety, we're seeing that they tend to be much more commonplace than we might have thought before. And again, it can affect people in different kinds of ways. So not all anxiety is considered a mental health problem, though. If we think about anxiety as the alarm system should go off when we're in danger. And again, I'm not trying to recall a story that you may not want to talk about in the podcast, but I remember that there was a trip that we were all on vacation together, and you guys were coming back, and there was a car accident that occurred. Now everybody was safe and everybody was fine,
Right.
but you had some anxiety afterwards about being in a car.
Mm-hmm.
And again, when there is, the alarm should have gone off, because in that accident you were in danger.
Mm-hmm.
Now, again, being young, trying to cope, those feelings may have come back because it was a close association to having been in the car. And sometimes we talk about post-traumatic stress disorder, or PTSD, as being a part of that. Well, when you look at it, though, the alarm went off legitimately
Mm-hmm.
when you were seeing the things that were getting ready to happen in the accident. And so if your heart is pounding faster and you're breathing in a little different way and your body is really getting ready to run or fight, normal.
Right.
When you get it now standing next to the car before you get in,
Right.
probably not in the same realm. If it keeps you from getting in the car, or it keeps you from driving the car, or it keeps you from doing the things that you would normally do. And so there's a fine line
Mm-hmm.
between those two things. And so I think sometimes people will say, well, I get anxious. Well, sometimes there's legitimate things to be anxious about.
Right. Right.
Okay, there are. Um, I think sometimes we fail to recognize, though, or we allow things to activate, like catastrophic thoughts, you know, um, for somebody that has been in a car accident, just as an example, for them to think before they're getting into the car again, they think, what if I'm in another accident? And there's the thought that feeds the anxiety, that begins to cause the same reaction, and then it begins to intensify with more thoughts like that. And so there's a relationship between the thinking and the feeling then at that point.
Well, I can say this, and maybe you can make sense of this. I don't feel anxious now before I get into a car. But if I'm in the car and I'm not driving, and somebody does something erratic, if somebody starts driving faster than normal, or, like a buddy starts wanting to show off his Mustang and I'm in the passenger seat, I will get a little anxious. Is that an effect of that, do you think?
There could be some residual effect of that. And again, um, I don't know, when I was growing up, our driver's ed teacher used to tell us the driver is the safest person in the car. Well, because we have all the control. We can brake, we can
Right.
throw the gas in, we can downshift if we're driving a stick. I mean, there's a lot of things that we can do to protect ourselves. Um, and so when you start looking at that, there is a sense of loss of control. But that may not be, that may be very similar to the kind of the pre-flight jitters that a person gets being in an airplane.
Okay.
Because we're talking about being thousands of feet above the earth.
It's a little abnormal.
Okay, not something, I mean, and there are some people that will get a little anxious about flying because they don't have that control.
Hmm.
You know,
Hmm.
and that's why they've invented Dramamine. But
Does work, by the way. I used to get motion sickness.
but again, when you think about that, it just there are some people that just need to have a better sense of control.
Yeah.
And but again, we also have to recognize that there are things that we can't control.
Right.
You know,
Now, when you talk about anxiety and depression as being kind of the major two in present day, is there a reason for that? Like, has there been, I'm sure there's been work done. I mean, in your opinion, are there any major links? I mean, one that's coming to mind for me is social media, but we'll get there. Maybe that's a jump, but
there are some people that will point to societal kinds of changes
okay.
that are a part of this, and so again, it would be easy for people to point to social media very easily. Um, we live in the information age. Well, we could take it a step further. We live in the information overload age, and so we're bombarded with so much information. We can't filter anything out. There is no sense of control.
Right.
Okay. And what happens? We start to get anxious. Um, you know, if you make it a point not to watch the evening news because every story seems to be talking about COVID right now, and you feel your anxiety go up, okay, well, you almost have to stop your social media because there are COVID stories that come up that way.
Hmm.
And if you're on Google search, or you got to go to Google something, well, guess what? There's a whole list of articles now that come up on this page where they're talking about various things with COVID. You're on Facebook, it comes up. You're on Instagram, it comes up. If you're doing Twitter, it comes up.
Right.
I'm not sure about Chapsnet, but I try to stay away from that. You know, but again, when you start looking at those things, again, the amount of information comes in, and there's not a way to filter it all.
Right.
We don't have a social media that's devoid of any kind of news.
Well, I think, straying away from the pandemic a little bit and kind of going a little bit more macro, I think the thing, in my opinion, with social media is people tend to portray the good in their life. Very few people put out that they're struggling. Now, more and more people may have done that recently, and maybe it's becoming a little bit more open in terms of, but most people post all the good, right? When they're happy, when things are
Well,
going well. And then in return, if you're the receiver of all these messages and you're struggling with anxiety, depression, or both, and all you're seeing on your feed, and you're addicted, because a lot of people are addicted, and all you're seeing are all these great things that everybody's doing, what do you start to do naturally? You start to compare yourself to these people, right? Well, my life isn't as good as that. Look where this person is. Oh, this person's in Hawaii. This person's in California. I'm over here just working my 9 to 5, and I wish I had that life. What do you think about that?
I've actually had people who who I've just interacted with interpersonally, and have been following them on Facebook. I said, "Oh, you look like things are very happy and everything," and they said to me, "Oh, that's my Facebook life,"
They're
and
the
I'm
most
like,
depressed.
"Right?
Yeah.
It may not be the real depiction." Yeah, you may be a little young on this one to remember this, but there used to be a commercial where you saw this frumpy middle-aged woman with rollers in her hair, and she's typing and says, "I'm 5'2", I weigh 109 pounds," and she's typing it, and the catchphrase was, "You can be anybody on the internet." And
Right.
I'm not so sure that the social media isn't a part of that, because you could be anybody. You know, you could be the number one mom because you see all these smiling pictures of your kids and all the fun activities that you do. And yet, the reality may be that those things are far, far, far from the truth, because this may be a mom that's neglecting or abusive or and all of these other things. And again, but they capture all the happy moments.
Hmm.
And that's what they depict and that they put out there. I think that can be a part of it sometimes. Um, you know, it's interesting to me because I think there's these weird things. Like if I notice something on somebody's post, I remember at times my own children would say, "Oh, you're looking at that? What's wrong with you?" Like somehow I'm not supposed to look at a post that is public, as if it's
Right.
supposed to be private information. And I'm like, wait a minute. I didn't ask to see that. I
Right.
didn't, I'm not stalking the person. It came up on my feed. And they think it's a little weird because I'm privy now to something that I don't know if they thought they were exclusively privy to, but there is not that sense of privacy at all
Right.
that goes with things. And so I get a little bit concerned about the people that are almost too public about private kinds of things. There's a person that I know that lost their mom recently, very unexpectedly, very awkward, kind of unusual circumstances. But every, you know, at least once a week now, we get a posting of some kind about, you know, how much she misses her mom and how painful it is and how difficult it is. And I'm thinking to myself, I'm not sure what her settings are,
Hmm.
but I don't know that I would want that out there for everybody to know. And I'm not sure that everybody out there is scrupulous enough to, you know, has the, you know, to really be privy to that. Because again, you can set yourself up to be exploited
Right.
um, in some ways. And I think to myself that you have to have some boundary of some kind, or you
But
need to have some boundary.
do you think that's a cry for help? The fact that she is so active on social media. I have seen, and this is communication research, some links. Of course, we can't prove cause and effect, but some links to high social media use and depression.
Yeah, well, I think what happens, and again, I think that there's an intervening variable there. The intervening variable is that high social media use means that you're spending hours in front of a screen, which usually is associated with, oh, that's right, social isolation, which is a hallmark that we associate with depression. In fact, if you look at some of the treatments for depression, one of the big ones that we talk about is IPT, interpersonal psychotherapy, where we have to help the person to build social skills to be able to connect better with people because they're very disconnected from folks. And that's a legitimate one of those, you know, treatments that is believed to have efficacy in dealing with depression.
And this is
Does
because they've spent so much time on their phone, so much time away from people.
Well, they're not integrating with people the way that they need to. We need people.
Mhm.
And again, I know we were trying to stay away from COVID, but COVID has been really isolating for many people.
Right.
And I think we yearn for and need that physical contact. Um, you know, I told you before we were going to do this tonight that I had to go to some calling hours. Um, you know, usually there'd be a lot more hugs, there'd be a lot more touching, there'd be a lot more handshaking. And, you know, there are people that are uncomfortable with that at this point because they don't know if you're a carrier. They don't know if you've had half the vaccine, the full vaccine. They don't know, right? And there we all are in masks at the, and you go, wait a minute, you know, we're not even being, and we need that contact.
Right.
And yet we have this crisis that has created less contact. Um, and we have less of an opportunity. When you look at um, the research on stress hormones, one of the stress hormones that we get at high levels is oxytocin. And oxytocin, interestingly enough, it promotes affiliation. It wants us to connect to other people. And some of that is, it's the stuff of hugging it out.
And face-to-face connection too, right?
Face-to-face connection. So it's the stuff of hugging it out, and it's making that connection. And uh, I think sometimes, um, in an effort to stay in touch, we do things like Zoom meetings, or we do things like Microsoft Team meetings, and we do those kinds of things, but it really can't replace the face-to-face interaction. But here in the COVID environment, it's had to replace.
Mm-hmm.
And you can tell sometimes because there's things that you miss out on, not interacting with the person directly. Although with the visual, it's a little better. But like I feel like when I'm doing therapy with somebody on the phone, because they don't have the capability to do video calls,
Mm-hmm.
and I know that some people can't fathom that, but there are people that either don't have the money to put into a camera.
Right.
We ordered cameras for the office back in March when this first happened, and they were still back ordered. We
Oh,
had to
yeah.
finally cancel the order and get substitute cameras to be put in because we just couldn't wait any longer. And we want our therapists to be able to do this kind of work with the cameras. But on the phone calls, I feel like blind.
Mm-hmm.
I can't do that intuitive sense of um, by picking up on the nonverbals, and it's lost in that process. And so, you find yourself doing verbal checks on a telephone session that you don't necessarily, hey, I'm just letting you know that I'm writing some things down right now. I know that there's this pause and this silence, and you may start to feel uncomfortable with it. Now, if somebody's getting uncomfortable and I'm sitting across from them while I'm taking a note, I can glance over and see that they're starting to get uncomfortable and
Right.
then can break the silence. But on the phone, I can't tell.
Right.
And I'm noticing that some people have different levels of what they will tolerate
Mm-hmm.
on silence. So in other words, what happens is that um, if I finish my sentence and I start to jot something down, and I had some kids yesterday, the minute I started jotting something down, they said, "Are you still there?" Like they're
Right.
expecting this sound to be going on the whole time and this interaction to be going on the whole time. And they're not even used to the give and take of the conversation
Mm-hmm.
because they don't usually make phone calls. They text,
Right.
they do, I believe that, and I know that I'm sure that I have colleagues that would disagree with this, there's a big push about telehealth and doing this and delivering services in this kind of way.
Mm-hmm.
But I think we're in the people business,
Mm-hmm.
and it's an interpersonal thing. And I think, yes, do I think if somebody is in an isolated area and that needs services that maybe we should do it this way and be able to be reimbursed for it? Certainly. But I think being in the office, having that face-to-face time, um, and again, I just begin to think it's so vitally important to be able to do that.
Mm-hmm.
In the classroom, and you may notice this, if you're doing any kind of online instruction right now, the missing component is that you don't have the face-to-face interaction.
Right.
I found that before I was officially retired, like last March when we had to shut down and go entirely online,
Mm-hmm.
that component of being able to read the room
Right.
or get the group dynamic was completely lost in
For
that
sure.
internet process. And it just, um, the lack of feedback
Yeah.
was really, really disconcerting
You
and
know,
uncomfortable.
it's interesting, and I agree with you. I think, I mean, for me personally, and I know from hearing you, you feel the same, that human interaction, I think, is what's missing, and a lot of people feel that it's important. Although it's been interesting to hear some students, not all, I mean, it's the minority here. Some have said that they've actually enjoyed online learning, and that, that they can do things on their own time, and I wonder, are there like a new generation of people who maybe have some certain personality characteristics that lend themselves, that um, or that enable them to build these connections online, and that they feel more comfortable in that environment? Or do
Well,
you think, yeah,
yeah, it's hard to know for sure. Um, I don't think that we would have seen, for example, the rise of the University of Phoenix if there wasn't some element that made and promoted the learning to be better.
right,
But there are companies that still have hiring managers who will choose not to take somebody from an online university over somebody that was on a brick and mortar university setting, and they won't say that out loud, but it's there.
because they're missing that human
They're
interaction,
missing that human interaction and that piece.
right?
And I think that the University of Phoenix in particular has kind of bent over backwards to make sure that they had those kinds of experiences.
Hmm.
But I think that sometimes there are some biases about those things, and that the brick and mortar universities still have somewhat of an advantage that way.
Right.
The other part of it is that I think that we live in an age where our lives are so busy and so full that being able to do something in your own time and in your own way is a bit of an advantage. And we're almost being trained for that. So, for example, my phone has a number of apps that I stream. I'm streaming things. And so if I can't watch television when the show is supposed to be on at 10 o'clock on Sunday night because I'm dog tired and I fall asleep, you know what? When I wake up at 4 in the morning and I can't go back to sleep, I can watch it then
Right.
on my phone
For sure.
with my earbuds in. All of a sudden, it begins to uh, it's a different level of convenience than what I'm used to having. And so there are some people who are really gravitating to that.
Hmm.
Do they learn the material as well? Do they not learn the material as well? Are they doing, I mean, those are the kind of questions that I see
Hmm.
maybe more of, and I get a sense of. And again, it depends on the kind of university that you're attending. I think in universities where you have first generation college students coming for the very first time, I think traditional learning has such great value.
Right.
Um, and you and I both know that they keep talking about things like um, the buzzwords at education have been about active learning.
Right.
Okay, I'm not convinced that the sage on the stage has lost all of its luster. That sometimes people want to have a lecture, and they want it to be interactive, and they want it to be something that they're going to be able to appreciate and take with them,
Hmm.
because that group project they may not remember as much from.
Right.
And so, you know, I think and look at this. I mean, what do people gravitate to? They're gravitating to, oh, that's right, YouTube videos, which is kind of like, the last time I checked, it's a passive recipient kind of learning that would be the equivalent of a lecture. Oh, that's right, a TED Talk,
It is.
which is absolutely, positively the epitome of a lecture.
Right.
Okay, so tell me that people are not gravitating a little bit to that traditional, and yet among educators.
Mhm.
Oh, uh, don't go into a college interview, interviewing for a position as a professor, and talk about your lecturing style. They don't want to hear it.
That's a good point. I could say from my vantage point, I try to combine lecturing and discussion. So I try to have like a pulse on when the lecture is working and when it's not. And when it's not, okay, let's switch, let's discuss, right? Let's make a pivot and then go back to lecture. So I like to say I'll lecture for 15 minutes, discussion for 10, lecture for 15, discussion for 10. And for the most part, I think that works. And I think the combination of things maybe work a little bit better with students of today's era.
I think sometimes it varies on the content area that you're dealing with.
That's true too.
So for example, um, I taught for many, many, many years. I taught the physio psych class, and the numbers that came back on our exit exams put our students head and shoulders above the national standards on that.
Mhm.
And I'm thinking to myself, well, this was the course. I mean, they were getting exposed to it in other parts of the curriculum, but this was the course. And this outcome measure says that it wasn't a bad thing. Now, people will complain it was 8 o'clock in the morning, or people will complain that it was a grind course, or people will complain like, I didn't realize there was so much biology to psychology. And I think, oh my gosh, mental health, biology, the relationship of the mind, the body, the emotions, and they're all connected. And this is the place where we connect it all.
Mhm.
I saw it as being a very valuable kind of tool. So I think that sometimes there's a room and place for that, but there's also room for the experiential. And, um, I can teach a lot of things about theory as psychology, but if I can breathe a life into it by bringing a clinical story into the classroom, that
Mhm.
was always and if I'm reading something in preparation for a class that I could take into the clinic with me and see a patient with. So for me, that was that combination of being the 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 student or the college professor to the students, but also then being the psychologist to patients, and to be able to amalgamate the two.
Mhm.
I thought was very, very important, so that when I'm talking about things like depression was the common cold of the industry, and I can begin to talk about different ways that depression manifests itself, and this patient's presentation was completely different than this patient, and this patient's presentation, but they were all still diagnosed as depressed.
Mhm. Mhm.
So we have diversity, um, even though depression is defined very narrowly in
Right.
terms of these criteria. And so it kind of helps people to understand the mental health component in a much different way.
So I've got
Uh,
I've
Go
got a
ahead.
couple questions. Do you believe that everyone at some point or another is depressed and anxious? Like, is this something everybody experiences on some level? And I know that might conflict with what you said with narrowly defining it, but if we defined it loosely, which I think most of our society has, does everybody feel some kind of anxiousness or depression at some point in their life?
I think that there are, remember, I believe that some anxiety is normal. And
Right.
I think that some depressed feelings are normal. And you're talking about the distinction between a, a clinical or a diagnosed anxiety and a clinical or diagnosed depression and others. And do I think that everybody is depressed at one time or another? I can't say that with 100% certainty, but I wouldn't say that as a yes, because um, I don't know that we would be. It would be like if we said that, it would be like depression is a pandemic. We don't have enough drug supplies, and we're going to overrun all of our resources. And we don't do that. There's somewhere around. Um, I think they talk about 25%
Okay.
of rate of mental health problems, and we see it in children, and then we see it in as they move into adulthood, and then we see it in the elderly. And it's not the same 25%. I mean,
Okay.
the rate is about 25% there, but it's not the same people.
So when somebody comes to you and says, um, Bob, I'm depressed, where do you start the process of saying, okay, let's find out if he or she actually is?
I think that for me, it's a matter of understanding how they define the term
Hmm.
and what kinds of things that. Well, what is it that tells you that you're depressed?
Hmm.
And you use that kind of language purposefully, because what you tell me when you say I'm depressed, it may mean something completely different than this other person does.
Sure.
And then when you talk about kids who don't necessarily have the verbal capacity to say that they're depressed, let me use this parallel. An adult, typically, if they believe that they're depressed, they come in and they say, I'm depressed.
Right.
And then you have to distill it down and boil it down and find out what symptoms they're having that either confirms or refutes depression. Because sometimes what they think is depression may not be.
Hmm.
Okay, so that's one piece. But then there's some parallels of depression that we see. So sometimes that child that has that bellyache, and it's a persisting bellyache, and they're medically clear and we can't find any reason for it, sometimes that's depression in the younger kid. Oh, where else do we see aches and pains and body aches and pains and stomach aches be depressed? We see it also on the elderly side,
Mm.
where they can't necessarily define the depression as depression per se, but it comes out as that physical health component without. And so we have the middle group that identifies depression that may or may not be an accurate description of what's going on. And then we have these two physical symptom things where we can't find anything medically wrong, and then sometimes it ends up being depression. So when we define it that way, it's kind of a moving target. It's not the same for everybody,
Right.
and it could be manifesting in different ways for different people at different points in their lives even.
Hmm.
Okay. Sometimes a man who has an extramarital affair, that extramarital affair is actually a symptom of depression.
Mm.
And you go, what? You know, and people sometimes they don't want to hear that. You get yourself into a little controversy, because they'll talk about their moral compass, and they'll talk about the other things that are supposed to prevent them from doing that. But there are some men who just feel so disconnected. Okay, and then this opportunity presents itself, and they are vulnerable to those kinds of things, and so
Mm.
sometimes it's a symptom of
Right.
depression, and people will go, what? How does that? But
Because most people just
so
don't think of it as that. They don't think of depression as being linked to that kind of situation.
well, and some depression is very, very functional.
Right.
Okay, I mean you can have somebody that's alcoholic and is a functional alcoholic and doesn't miss a day of work in 35 years.
Right.
It doesn't mean they're not an alcoholic.
Right.
Okay, they're a functional alcoholic. You can have people that have very functioning kinds of depression.
Okay.
They haven't missed a day of work in 35 years. It doesn't mean they're not depressed.
Okay. So if there's a big spectrum, is there a big spectrum in terms of how to manage, how to cope?
I think that's why we have to tailor treatment to the individual, because it's not as easy as one size fits all in terms of treatment. I think sometimes the implication of differential diagnosis in terms of mental health problem is differential treatment. Well, we don't treat diagnoses, we treat people.
Mm.
And so sometimes the way that those symptoms may manifest for one person may be dramatically different. Now, there are threads that we can draw from in terms of various kinds of therapies to help the person,
Hmm.
okay? But I get sometimes afraid, a little afraid, because when they do these studies about which treatment in depression is more effective, again, they're basing it on the diagnosis. They're not basing it on the person.
Hmm.
And I think the treatment plan has to be about the person.
So they're trying to
Uh,
quantify something that's really qualitative. I mean, it's.
right, right, and it is that kind of difference between those kinds of things, that qualitative and quantitative analysis. And
Mhm.
so I'm not saying that those things don't have um, some effectiveness, because I do believe that they do. But I get skeptical of the way that the research was conducted and whether or not you can apply that to everybody.
Right.
You know, um, there are some people who will do very well with mindfulness, okay, but they also, they also have an advantage when they do yoga, and they also have an advantage. You know what I'm saying? That they can be in that kind of modality to do that. And there are other people who will absolutely, if you say, well, I want you to be at one with the anxiety for a moment, and I want you to do, and they'll just look at you and go, what, uh, and they want to know what planet you're from, and you wonder whether or not you've grown a third head, because they're looking at you in this odd way, presuming you can get the nonverbals from them and you're seeing them face to face.
Right.
You know what I'm saying? And they give you this look like, who's the crazy one here?
Right. So how long does it take for you, on average? I know every case is different. To start offering suggestions, to start offering things that they can do.
Sometimes, depending on the nature of what's being presented, sometimes you jump right in. And it's not really necessarily the way that it's probably the best, because if you jump in too quickly, you may make the mistake of not thoroughly kind of investigating enough to know. Um, Generally, I start off pretty slowly,
Mm.
and I want to be able to understand what they're going through. How are they eating? How are they sleeping? Are they having any physical health? Are they on any medications? Did the changes that they're experiencing accompany any of the changes when they were put on medication or not? Um, I need to know that kind of information, because I'm looking for relationships between things,
Hmm.
and the kinds of things that have gone on. Um, it's That's important kind of piece, because you do this assessment, you kind of put the person under the magnifying glass to see what you can find. Now, that's one dimension to it, but sometimes people are coming in immediate crisis, and if you don't have something for them to take with them in the first visit,
Hmm.
they may not be back.
Hmm.
And so there is almost a sense of clinical intuition that you develop, and you kind of get a sense of another person. um, for those of you into the Marvel comics, you get a spidey sense about it, and you get that sense of, this person needs something right now.
Right. Right.
Um, and then again, there are other people where what they need is the relationship. Well, relationships take time,
Hmm.
and you're not going to get a relationship in one visit. I can gather information, I can structure the treatment, I can do some general rapport building, but that relationship is going to develop over time.
Hmm.
Uh, in the pediatric work that I've done, I think um, sometimes I can use the relationship that I've developed with the child to help me to leverage change in terms of behavioral kind of changes that need to take place. And I find it much easier if I have a good relationship with them, because they trust me, and they
Hmm.
trust that I'm not going to steer them in the wrong direction. Adults can be very much the same way. If they feel a sense of trust with you, um, they can do that, and they can connect. And so you have to be accessible to them emotionally. You have to be accessible to them and meet them at their own level.
Hmm.
Um, there was this, um, uh, as you're finding out, I'm a big storyteller about these kind of things. But I had this client that I was working with, and he and I kind of had the same kind of humor, and he had this humor thing. Well, I happened to see, um, there was a clip of Bob Newhart, who was the famous he at one time played a famous TV psychiatrist, and he uh, he's on, I think, like one of those variety shows where he was just doing a sketch, and his cure for the person was to say "stop it," and and so it was like a video you could pick up on YouTube, and I knew that he would like it, and I said to him, "Stop it." Well, the closing line of this thing, and not that I want to spoil it for anybody, but the closing line of this thing, uh, you know, he says to the woman, "Stop it before I stuff you in a box and leave you there to suffocate." And so I'm doing a video call with my client who I had mentioned this story to, and he was really like going to look it up, and he thought it was going to be funny for him, and he's doing, and the video comes up, and there he is. He's covered in a box, and on the outside of the box it says "Stop it." You're scrawling on the box, and he pushes the box up, and he says, "You were running a little late today. I thought I might actually suffocate in that box," which was the funniest thing he could have possibly said. And there was this whole sense of humor about the thing. But again, I think I may have even had an intern with me on that day, and she said, "Boy, you have a great relationship with the people that you work with." And I'm thinking, you have to have a good relationship,
Right.
because you have to be able to confront them about things that aren't moving
They have to trust you.
sometimes, and they have to have a sense of trust in you.
Yeah.
And if they don't, if you can't connect, sometimes it's very difficult to affect change.
Right.
Change is one of those things that could be, you know, it can be about caring and confronting. So
Hmm.
if you want to bring about change, you got to be able to do those two things. So I don't, where are we at time wise? I'm sorry, because I'll keep talking about mental health stuff all day.
No, it's great. It's great. Yeah, we'll wrap it up here in a little bit, but
Okay.
I want to kind of this will be an interesting. It's not a direct question, but I think it'll lead to a discussion. I'm going to make myself a little vulnerable and talk about and I'm thinking about talking about my own struggles maybe, and I'm not sure if it's depression, anxiety, or anything of the sort. Maybe it's a combination, but I can say how I've managed it, and I think I'm at a point now where I can almost feel it coming on and know exactly how to respond. And I don't know if that's something that I've just kind of built up through experience, but things like deep breathing exercises, meditation. I am an avid meditator for the last 2.5, 3 years. I meditate every morning, every night. Not a lot of people know about it. I think it's something that I keep somewhat private. Because sometimes people look at you, like meditation, like, ooh, voodoo. Um, so maybe it's not even the correct word. Mindfulness maybe um, makes people feel better when we say it that way. But what is there something to that to finding what works for you and being able to manage it when you feel any type of these feelings coming on, whether it be anxiety or depression? Because I feel like when I maybe was more depressed or more anxious, again, I don't know which is which in the situation, or maybe a combination. I've noticed that when I didn't know how to manage it, that it would twofold and threefold, and it's kind of like a cycle.
Right.
But if I can stop that cycle, or at least notice that if I don't stop this cycle, it's going to get worse, that I can manage it. And it might last a day, but I know it's going to be gone tomorrow or gone the next day.
I think what you're talking about, though, is coping.
Yeah.
And coping is a part of us being resilient. And resilience is really the piece. Like, we can weather those storms, or we can weather those times,
Right.
and we can find ways of doing it. I talked to somebody the other day, and with the changes with COVID, again, it's all coming back to COVID again, but with the changes in COVID, they have not had the physical outlet that they had. They'd go crank iron and they would
Oh yeah,
work it up. And for them, the perfect stress reliever was pushing the weights around
for sure.
and doing that. Well, they haven't been able to do that
Hmm.
because the gym hours are now restricted and they couldn't get in, or the gym had already had too many people come in and they can't let anybody else into the building. And this is, they're only open for another 20 minutes. And now I can't get my workout in. And
Right.
so but it's different for different people. There are some people that are more, um, they're going to buffer their, their, um, their coping maybe more in their head. Other people are going to have more of an outlet from a physical standpoint.
Mhm.
Um, there's some people that as they age, they become less physical. And so then they're going to have to develop more of the mind kind of strategies in order to cope with something, in order to be able to deal with something. And there are times when the things that have worked well for us, that the stresses may exceed our ability or seemingly exceed our ability to cope, where we actually literally have too much on our plate.
Mhm.
I'll never forget, I had a guy that came in and was kind of like, he had this unrealistic fear that if he saw somebody like myself, that we were just going to try to get into his psyche and delve into his childhood and do all of these other kinds of things. And I remember there was a sense of relief when I simply said to him, listen, based on our discussions over the last couple of meetings, I said, you have too much on your plate. And the things that you usually did to cope with those things are not working right now because there's more there's more demand on those resources than there has ever been before.
Mhm.
I said, so we have to do one of two things. We either have to reduce what's on your plate or teach you better coping strategies. And I don't think I need to go back to your childhood in order to do that. And there was this whole sense of relief that came over him, because that his biggest fear was that somebody was going to bring him into therapy, keep him in therapy for the rest of his natural days, that we were going to just deconstruct his entire childhood, and that there was that there was not going to be any benefit in that for him.
Right.
And that the only person that was going to benefit would be me, and paying for my colleges, my children's college, I think is what he said to me. Because he was very cynical about this whole process. But when I put it in those terms, we have a finite amount of resources to cope.
Mhm.
And when the things exceed our ability to cope, guess what? We have to either develop new coping skills or get rid of some of the stress, period.
Right.
6 of one or half dozen of the other. I mean, for the
Sure.
same outcome. And so I think sometimes we have strategies that we use. And it's what makes the human being such a resilient creature, that we
Mhm.
can bounce back from something like the stress of COVID-19. It's how we can bounce back from just having moments of, hey, I find that these rituals for me are really helpful for me in terms of dealing with my day-to-day stuff. Or
Right.
when the day-to-day stuff starts to get overwhelming to me, it really helps me. Um, and again, it could be anything from relaxation training to deep breathing, to practicing yoga, to doing meditative work, to going and pumping iron at the gym.
Mhm.
Um, there are different ways that we cope with different kinds of things. It may be immersing myself in the jumble,
Yeah.
because all of a sudden or a Sudoku puzzle, because all of a sudden in that moment, I don't have to think about anything else that's
Right.
bothering me.
Right.
I'm just getting away.
Mhm.
Um, and again, we
Sometimes
talk
that's a
about,
sport. Sometimes that's golf or fishing. Those are two that come to mind.
those are, and again, I think when you consider that the two basic human activities are work and play, you begin to think, um, about that, and you go, um, if we work hard, we're going to have to play hard. And sometimes the things that stress us out in terms of the work will be also, we do the opposite kinds of things when we get away and the things that we do to play.
Mm-hmm.
And so we find that eventuality between work and play. An embarrassing story that I could share with you, um, from the classroom. I remember one morning I came into class. It was 8 o'clock in the morning, and I asked the class. I said, uh, "Who could tell me what the two basic human activities are?" So we had eating and sleeping, and we had eating and sex, and we had sleeping and sex, and nobody was getting close to work and play. I mean, it
Huh.
was just like, and so you could tell they hadn't read the chapter, and so you couldn't get anything close to work and play, and suddenly this one very quiet kind of co-ed puts up her hand, and she says, "Does it have anything to do with pleasure?" Well, that was the closest thing to play that I had heard, and this was going on way too long.
Right.
And I had this spontaneous utterance, and I said, "Yes, yes, yes. And what is it exactly that we do to pleasure ourselves?" Which was not the thing to say to a class at 8 o'clock in the morning. And I remember my face turning, I could feel it. I could feel my cheeks turning bright red. She never spoke again in the class. I will tell you that, there's one thing to put somebody off about speaking up is a moment like that. And, and in light of all of the other discussions, but in that moment, we had come very close to play. And again, you have to be able to have fun
Right.
and enjoy things.
Right.
And you strive to be able to enjoy things. And that those enjoyments can sometimes be very helpful in terms of coping strategy, and
Mm-hmm.
can be part of what you incorporate into a coping strategy. But we all do different things to play.
Right. Right.
Everybody's got a different level of activity. So when we start talking about coping strategies, we have as many variables as we do different ways that we play and entertain ourselves with.
Sure. Sure. And I think going back to one point before we wrap this up, the fact that humans are so unique and so different. And I think the one thing that I've always been stuck on, I forget where I read this or heard this or saw this, but the thing that separates us from animals and plants is we have an imagination. And it's kind of a double-edged sword, right? Because what you do with that imagination plays into your emotions and your state of mind and where you are mentally. Do you have any thoughts on that?
There would be people that would tell us that we know more about somebody's emotional state, not in terms of the event,
Hmm.
but their interpretation of the event will tell us more about how they feel.
Hmm.
Okay, so let me use this example. I'm not trying to be morbid, having come from calling hours tonight. If the person's interpretation of going to calling hours was she's not suffering anymore, there's a different emotional component to that than for the person who looks at that and says, we lost her way too soon.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
Okay, and so when we talk about emotional reactions to things, I often go back to how's the person interpreting the event,
Interesting.
because the interpretation is going to tell us more about how the person feels.
Mm.
Right? If you and I are walking down a narrow hallway and I bump you with my elbow, if you see me and you look over and you see a big grin on my face and you see that I'm doing it to have fun with you and walk down the hallway,
Right.
you might have a different emotional reaction than if you think that I did it on accident, which the feeling might be much more neutral. Or if your interpretation was I did it to hurt you, you're going to be angry.
Mm-hmm.
Same event,
Mm-hmm.
bumping elbows, going down a narrow hallway, 3 different emotional reactions based on the interpretation.
Right.
And I think sometimes we lose track of the fact that there is a component of what we think in anything that we feel,
Mm.
you know.
Mm-hmm.
Um, it's just something to think about.
Yeah, I think that's a perfect way to leave it and to end it tonight. This has been a great discussion, moving away from politics a little bit, talking about something that I think we can all agree on,
Yeah,
or at least all listen to and learn from.
we want to be able to find a way to be healthy,
Hmm.
and uh, there are people that strive for that physically, and there are people that we want to do that both mentally, emotionally, um, socially, um, some extent. I guess we could throw in spiritually,
Hmm.
and those things are unique to us as human beings, I think. And we want to be able to have experiences and relating to each other and connecting to each other. And we
Right.
have to be cautious because there are some things that separate us now that didn't separate us before. Um, Sometimes the social media can be a barrier.
Mm-hmm.
Sometimes what's going on in the world can be a barrier, like COVID-19 can be a barrier to connecting. We think about the number of senior citizens and the suffering they went through, sometimes being in that isolated place of a nursing home, and they weren't able to get that contact with the family, and how difficult that was, and how much decline we saw in folks in that process. And so it says something about how delicate the balance is in terms of mental health,
Hmm.
and how much we need each other.
Right.
Uh,
Right.
you know,
And hopefully we're able to all be together physically soon,
yeah,
for
we're
sure.
moving in that direction. We're
Yeah.
moving in that
Yeah.
direction.
And I don't think this will be the last time we'll talk about mental health. I think tonight was a good way to kind of go macro with it, but I can envision a whole nother podcast on how technology has impacted mental health and how it's changed over the years. So I think this will be a nice jumping off point for later topics.
Wonderful, wonderful. As always, it's good to talk to you, and it's wonderful to share with people that like to see what our podcasts are all about. So,
Definitely. Thank you all for listening in too, and we welcome you to come back and join us next time.
take
Thank you.
care.